This video will be all about the different types of connective tissues. Let's begin just by giving an overview of what a connective tissue is based on its structure and function. First of all, connective tissues vary. There's a lot of different types of them, largely based or defined by their extracellular matrix. Some of them could be liquid, so an obvious one is blood. So blood is a fluid or liquid connective tissue. Some of them are kind of what we would call semi-solid or kind of gel-like. For example, these loose connective tissues, areolar connective tissue, adipose is kind of gel-like. And then they could be very solid. Bone is a connective tissue. There's actually two types of bone tissue. Both of them are very solid. Cartilage is a connective tissue. Cartilage is kind of a semi-solid as well. So a lot of different varieties based on the extracellular matrix. This matrix tends to have what we would call ground substance, which is kind of either liquid or calcium phosphate, stuff like that. It's also going to have proteins. For example, collagen is a very common protein in connective tissue. It might have elastic fibers, which give the tissue elasticity, which is, the ability to stretch a little bit and then recoil. Most connective tissues are vascularized, meaning they have blood vessels. A couple exceptions to that rule: tendons lack blood vessels, and cartilage lacks blood vessels. Okay, so we're going to begin with areolar connective tissue. You can break down connective tissues into five basic types. You have what's called loose connective tissue, which areolar is an example of that, where the proteins are kind of loosely arranged. And there's going to be three of those: areolar, adipose, and reticular. Then we're going to talk about the dense connective tissues, and that's where the proteins are kind of packed tighter together, and there's three types of dense connective tissues. Then we're going to get into cartilage, and there's three types of cartilage. Then we'll get into bone. Like I mentioned, there's a couple types of bone tissue, and then we'll wrap it up looking at blood. So the first one is called areolar connective tissue. It is the most widely distributed, so basically it's all over the place. It contains a lot of different proteins. It's going to have collagen fibers in there, elastic fibers in there, and then what's called reticular fibers. So collagen typically is for strength. It'll strengthen the tissue. Elastic fibers give it a little bit of elasticity. And then reticular fibers are kind of a structural protein as well. The word reticular means branching, so it's kind of branching proteins that are found in the extracellular matrix. There's going to be what we call ground substance. In this case, it's kind of a semi-fluid or semi-solid. A lot of times we would refer to this as kind of gel-like connective tissue. The primary cells that you would find are called fibroblasts. So fibroblasts produce the fibers. So they're cells that produce these protein fibers. But you're also going to have some other cells in there. You might have some immune cells in there, kind of looking for any pathogens that might be present. If you were to cut your skin and a pathogen gets into the dermis, you're going to find this tissue in the dermis of skin, and you're going to want some immune cells there. Location, again, it's kind of in and around a lot of body structures. A lot of times we might refer to it as kind of packing material or filler material, just where, you don't really need any other special tissue, you'll put this stuff there. One of the main areas we're going to get to, again, in the next chapter is the papillary region of the dermis. So this is a kind of a real basic drawing of skin, where you have the epidermis, which you've already learned, that's keratinized, stratified squamous. You're going to have the dermis underneath it, and that's where you're going to find some of this stuff, so this areolar connective tissue. You're also going to find another type of connective tissue in that dermis called irregular connective tissue. Below the dermis, there's a layer of fat called the hypodermis, and then you might eventually get to, say, a muscle. So there's a lot of layers as you go into the human body. So again, be able to identify it. This picture would be the picture you'll see one day. Know basically that it's, all over the place, widely distributed. A really specific area would be what's known as the papillary region of the dermis. And again, we'll get to that again in the next chapter. Next one is adipose. Adipose is also considered a loose connective tissue. It has a lot of cells called adipocytes. Adipo means fat, so these are fat-storing cells. They store fat in the form of triglycerides. You find this, widely distributed as well. You're going to find a lot of it underneath the skin, so there's a layer called the subcutaneous or hypodermis. You're going to have some on the heart. It's actually protecting some of the blood vessels that are found on your heart. You protect the kidney with fat. There's a layer of fat around kidneys. Behind your eyeballs, there's actually a lot of fat. That's going to protect the nerves that go to your eyeballs, and there's some muscles back there. It's used for padding around joints. It's found in the breast, around the mammary glands. So it's kind of all over the place. Again, it can be protective. It can help reduce heat loss. So it's part of our thermoregulatory function, where it kind of keeps heat in the body. And then it stores energy, again, in the form of triglycerides. And adipose is pretty easy to identify, I think, because you're going to see these adipocytes, these cells, that kind of look like they're empty, but they're not. They're filled with triglycerides. So these are all cells, and the triglycerides kind of push the nucleus off to the side, so you really don't see the nucleus because it's kind of squished over to the side of the cell. So that's adipose tissue. The third loose connective tissue is called reticular. And again, reticular means branching. So you're going to have these reticular fibers in there that kind of look like little branches, kind of like branches of a tree. The cells that produce those fibers are called reticular cells. This tissue is for structure, primarily. There's organs that need a little structural support. For example, the liver, spleen, and lymph nodes. So here's a drawing of a lymph node. Here's a drawing of the spleen. This would be what it looks like under the microscope. One additional function for it is it kind of acts like a filter. So these lymph nodes and the spleen, what they do is they filter out microbes. So the microbes will actually kind of get trapped by these reticular fibers, and then immune cells will kill the foreign microbes. So supporting framework, that's often called a stroma. So a stroma is kind of like, I've heard it referenced as like a soft skeleton of an organ. So it gives it that structural support. The next three we're going to learn are all under the category of dense connective tissues. So notice in these drawings, the protein fibers, in this case, this is all collagen fibers, kind of this wavy, fibrous proteins in here are collagen fibers. And notice how they're packed very densely. So this is considered a dense connective tissue. It's known as regular because of the collagen arrangement. The collagen fibers are running all parallel to one another. So they're kind of regularly arranged. They're not randomly arranged. So the collagen fibers are parallel. There's fibroblasts kind of in between some of that collagen because you're going to need cells that produce and maintain the collagen. So those are the fibroblasts. This stuff is found in tendons and ligaments. And I remind you, a tendon is going to be attaching a muscle to a bone, whereas a ligament is going to be attaching or holding bones together, bone-to-bone attachment. The tissue is almost identical. So like in this little drawing, here's a tendon of this muscle. This is your biceps muscle. So this little tendon is attaching the biceps to your scapula. And then there's a little ligament kind of holding the scapula and clavicle together, and that's a ligament. So what's the main function? Strength in kind of one direction. So it's not going to be strong in all different directions. It's going to have strength when it gets pulled on. We call that pulling tension. So it has tensile or pulling strength. So that's regular. Now notice regular compared to irregular. The irregular connective tissue, the collagen is kind of randomly or irregularly arranged. So it's not running all in the same direction. It's not parallel. Everything else is pretty similar. It's just the arrangement of the collagen that's different. And what that does is it gives strength in more than just one direction. So tissue that tends to get pulled on in different directions might have this irregular connective tissue. The classic location that I definitely will most likely ask you is the reticular region of the dermis. So here's another image of skin. This is an actual image of skin, where you have the epidermis up here, again, keratinized, stratified squamous. There's a thin layer of areolar. So like all in here and just beneath that epidermis is the areolar connective tissue. And then deeper you go into the dermis, down here is where you're going to find that irregular connective tissue. So this is all collagen kind of running in all different directions. So now when your skin gets kind of hit at different angles, it has that strength. So that's a good location to remember. The joint capsules, so that, again, that's found at joints, and it kind of encapsulates the joint because joints move in a lot of different directions. And then a lot of the heart valve structural component is made up of irregular connective tissue. All right, so the key word here is kind of to remember that it's in many directions. Irregular collagen. Next one is called elastic connective tissue. It's another one of these dense connective tissues. What makes it different than the other two is it has an abundance of elastic fibers. And elastic fibers give the tissue the ability to be stretched and then recoil, all right, kind of bounce back, kind of like a rubber band. You'll notice that it tends to have kind of these wavy fibers. Those wavy fibers in there are the elastic fibers. It almost acts like a spring where it will, get stretched and then recoil back. And this one should make a lot of sense when you think about where you find it. Lung tissue. So when you inhale, your lungs actually stretch, and then when you exhale, they recoil, and that helps you breathe out air. So lungs have a lot of elastic connective tissue. And then the wall of arteries. So arteries have to stretch and then recoil when the heart contracts and then relaxes. So when you take a pulse, what you're feeling is an artery. And every time your heart ventricles contract, the pressure is going to go up in those arteries, and they're going to have to be able to stretch. Then when that heart relaxes, the artery recoils. So every time that heart beats, an artery stretches and then recoils. So you can count how many beats by feeling the pulsating elastic arteries. All right. So those were the 3 dense connective tissues. So we got 6 down. We did 3 loose connective tissues. We did 3 dense connective tissues. Now we're moving into the 3 cartilages. You've probably heard about cartilage. What comes to mind usually is maybe your nose has cartilage, your ears have cartilage. You've probably heard the fact that joints have cartilage. But you probably never knew that there's 3 types of cartilage. The first one is called hyaline cartilage. Hyaline actually means like clear. This cartilage is kind of a clear tissue. It only looks purple here because they actually used a dye and stained it purple. But hyaline comes from a word meaning kind of clear. But it can be a little bluish, and then again, usually it's stained a color. So what is hyaline cartilage? Well, it has kind of a gel-like, kind of rubbery ground substance that, it's kind of like rubber, where it's pretty tough, but it's not as, strong as, say, bone, but it's going to offer quite a bit of strength. The cells that are in cartilage are called chondrocytes. Chondro means cartilage. When we get to bone cells are called osteocytes. And if you remember, muscle cells are called myocytes. So chondrocytes are in cartilage. They're actually found in little compartments called a lacuna. So if you look at this tissue, the cells are sitting inside here, but that little structure that kind of houses the cell is called a lacuna. So that's kind of a classic appearance that you see in cartilage. In the ground substance, in this kind of extracellular matrix, you're going to find a lot of collagen, but the key is that the collagen is very, very thin. So when you look at it under the microscope, you actually don't really see the collagen. Again, if you look back at the regular and irregular connective tissues, you can actually see the collagen fibers. Whereas in this hyaline cartilage, they're so thin you can't really see them. This is the most abundant cartilage, so it's kind of found in a lot of different locations. One job is to protect the end of long bones. So here we have a bone. This would be the femur. So this is a knee joint here. There's the end of your femur, and it has a covering onto it of hyaline cartilage. There's the tibia, and the tibia has cartilage. So wherever you have bone-to-bone connections, you're going to have cartilage. That provides a nice smooth surface, and it protects the bones. Costal cartilage, costal means ribs. So costal cartilage attaches your ribs to your sternum. And that allows the thoracic cage, or your chest, to be able to have not just protection to protect your lungs, but also gives it the ability to expand a little bit. You don't want your ribs connecting directly to your sternum. Ribs and bone, it's too rigid. You wouldn't be able to expand your chest cavity. Your nose has a lot of hyaline cartilage. In fact, your whole respiratory tract has a lot of this. Your nose, your larynx. Your larynx, you've probably heard of your Adam's apple in your neck. That's the larynx. And that has a lot of cartilage, hyaline cartilage. Trachea or windpipe, your other airways, your bronchi and bronchial tubes. So a lot of this in your respiratory tract. Why do you need it in there? To support that tube. You want that tube open all the time. Because you're always either moving air down to your lungs or moving air out of the lungs. So you want your respiratory tract to be always open and not be able to collapse. And then the last thing you'll notice here, embryonic and fetal skeleton. So a lot of our bones are first cartilage. So when they're made during embryonic development and they grow during fetal development, a lot of those bones are actually made up of cartilage. And then eventually that cartilage kind of gets, kind of transitions into bone tissue. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the skeletal system. So you'll notice function, smooth surface at joints, flexibility but support, and it actually can fracture. So a lot of times when someone, say, breaks their nose, it's not a bone that breaks. It might be the cartilage of the nose. And you can also break that costal cartilage that's attached to ribs. So that's hyaline cartilage. Next one is fibrocartilage. You can kind of see why it was called fibrocartilage. You can see the little fibers. The fibers are collagen, but now you can actually see the collagen under the microscope because the collagen is thicker. So that's really the main difference, is instead of thin collagen, you have thicker collagen. And what that does is it provides more strength. So this is the strongest cartilage. So, maybe hyaline cartilage just wouldn't be strong enough. So the body developed this extra strong cartilage, fibrocartilage. And I want you to remember 3 places. Intervertebral discs, so those are the discs in your back, right? They're in between vertebrae. So here's a couple vertebrae here, and in between are these discs. And a lot of that disc has fibrocartilage. Very strong because you've got all this weight in between those vertebrae. The menisci of the knee, you've probably heard of a meniscus. Menisci is plural because each knee actually has 2 of them. And there's a lot of weight there as well. So these little menisci are pads in between your femur and your tibia in the knee joint. And then there's a joint called the pubic symphysis. It basically holds your 2 hip bones together in the front. We'll learn more about that in the joint chapter. But that's a very strong connection in between your hip bones. So strongest type of cartilage, again, if you want to look for these fibers in here, these thin collagen fibers, but also see these chondrocytes sitting in these little containers. That's going to kind of give you a hint that it's cartilage. Okay, the third cartilage is elastic cartilage. So as the name suggests, this is going to have, pretty much all the same things as the other cartilages, but much more elastic fibers. So that's going to really give it the ability to bend and kind of recoil back. So this is the most flexible cartilage. 2 structures I want you to remember: the epiglottis, which functions as a lid to your respiratory tract at the larynx. So this prevents food or liquid or any other objects from getting down into your respiratory tract. Specifically when you swallow. So when you swallow something, this lid closes. So it kind of has to be able to move, right? It moves down and covers the larynx, and then it can pop back up. I always think of those trash cans where if you step on that little lever, it opens up. That's kind of what the epiglottis does. It opens up when you're breathing, and then it closes when you swallow. And then you have your auricle, which is the outer part of your ear. If you bend that ear, it's going to flop back to where it originally was, because there's quite a bit of elastic cartilage in your ear. All right, so that's elastic cartilage. Kind of looks similar to the previous one. I would look for a little thicker fibers in here, because those elastic fibers are a little thicker than what you see in that fibrocartilage. Okay, next one, bone. And there's a whole chapter that we talk about bone tissue, so we don't need to go crazy here, but when you look at a particular bone, let's say it's the femur, this actually happens to be the proximal end of the femur where it attaches to your hip. Bones have 2 types of bone tissue. They have what's known as compact bone. That's typically going to be seen, on the outer, more superficial surface of a bone. And then it's going to have spongy bone, which is more on the inside of the bone. And you can see why they called it spongy. It kind of looks like a sponge there, where there's little spaces in between the bone, and that's where you're going to find bone marrow. So compact bone, outer parts, spongy bone on the inside, and it's going to house or kind of contain your bone marrow. Compact bone, typically, nothing else looks like compact bone. It kind of looks like you cut through a trunk of a tree, in that it has kind of this layering look to it, and then it has a little canal down the center called the central canal. And we'll talk more about this tissue, like I mentioned, in another chapter, but that's what compact bone looks like. Spongy bone, usually you see a little bit of the bone tissue here, and then this space here, here, and here is going to have bone marrow. Cells osteocytes. So osteo means bone, cyte means cells. So you're going to have a lot of cells in there called osteocytes. So bone obviously is there for support, protection, houses your bone marrow, and it serves as a lever when you're moving using skeletal muscle. All right, so two types of bone tissue. Last connective tissue is liquid, it's blood, and obviously that's a topic for AMP2 when we get to the cardiovascular system. But this tends to be a pretty easy one to identify. It's got liquid ground substance that's called the plasma, and then it has the cells, white blood cells and red blood cells, and then little platelets. Red blood cells are red because of hemoglobin. They're also known as erythrocytes because erythro means red. White blood cells, they're actually not white and they're actually not purple. They were stained. That's why white blood cells tend to look like purple cells under the microscope. And leuco means white, so white cells. And then platelets form blood clots. And thrombo means a blood clot. So these are fragments that help form blood clots. And I think we know what blood does. It transports. So those are your connective tissues. That's a big one, right? There's a lot of different types. Again, try to focus on identification. Think about, why that tissue is where it is and the function of that tissue. The final video, we're going to do the 3 types of muscle tissue, and then we'll wrap things up taking a quick look at nervous tissue. So the next video will be a little bit shorter than our previous 2.